So I'm going to go and open up to the audience for questions. Please raise your hand. Someone will bring you a microphone. Wait for the microphone because that will allow us to record you. And I'll take a couple of questions and then come back to Raj and we'll go back and forth. It looks like we've got some online questions as well. So why don't you start with this woman here? And if you would say your name and your affiliation as well. Thanks. Obviously, the microphone doesn't want your question confiscated. Do we have a second working mic?
We do.
All right, we'll just shout it out, and we'll fix the.
Is it working?
Oh. Hello.
Yay.
All right.
Sorry.
Take it back. Don't shout it.
Okay. So earlier you mentioned how you need to bring along the people who voted for Brexit and for Trump, and just now you were talking about student groups and church groups and so on. So I was wondering whether you believe that the Rockefeller Foundation has a role in doing that.
You want me to take one more? Or you want to?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. And then the gentleman behind here will kind of move across the room here.
Thank you. Rupert Simons from Publish What You Fund. Welcome to London.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming, even though we're on the verge of leaving the international community ourselves. I wanted to ask a question about a speech you gave a few weeks ago where you said the Rockefeller Foundation will be getting back into science, technology, and data in a big way. So as a big proponent and enthusiast of data publication, data use, that sounds great. Curious if you could expand on what you mean by getting back into data in a big way, where you think the data revolution's going, and please tell me it's not just blockchain. Thank you.
Well, those are both good questions. Let me tackle the first. I do think it's anyone doing philanthropic work has to be engaged in building public consensus and doing the educational and advocacy work to help people see how they can participate in this mission. And I've had the benefit of, I've sat in a church in inner city Detroit. I grew up around Detroit, and a community that down on its luck every week takes a collection for an orphanage in Rwanda. And I've seen farmers in Fort Benton, Montana, and we've sat around the table and talked about at the time we were launching a program we called Feed the Future to help millions of small-scale farmers around the world. And I concluded that by saying, can you call your members of Congress and tell them you support these kinds of efforts? Because they really did. They said, we're food producers, we understand what it means to be a farmer, and we want to help others. We feel blessed and we want to help others. So I think doing that political work is really important, and too often in this community we get excited about the data that comes out of our projects and how we publish it and talk to each other, and we don't talk enough to folks just about the common values that this work represents. And so, yeah, it's part of our mission to take that on, and we're going to do more to ensure that different types of communities inside the United States in particular are aware of and have the ability to advocate for the kinds of priorities we believe are important. On the data question, I'll just give you a story. On that same trip to Nairobi and Ethiopia, we were in Uganda, and we were talking to entrepreneurs who had created these off-grid solar businesses and offering power to, I think, 6,000 homes in northern Uganda. And I said, well, what's the most interesting thing that's happened to you in the last year? And they said, both Facebook and Google have offered us money for access to our data. And at the end of the day, collecting data and having information on the consumer behavior, the power consumption, the incidence of disease, the epidemiological spread of certain pathogens, all of that is going to become a bigger and bigger part of allowing us to be more effective at tackling these problems. And if you believe, as I think many do that are operating in a more tech-savvy environment, that large-scale data collection combined with machine learning will offer a new set of tools greatly enhance the efficiency and efficacy of this work. I think we want to really understand that and be a part of it, be a trusted partner so that not all of the data on the world's emerging populations or the current world's poor sit in private hands, but it really become a public good that can be leveraged to drive our goals of ending poverty and ending under 5-child death and ending hunger and malnutrition as we know it. So in many ways, it's a super exciting time to be in this business. Blockchain is exciting, but it's not the only thing that's exciting in that context. And that's also why we're so excited about this effort Olivia's leading around collaborative philanthropy, because if we can get some of the people who really understand how to build these data tools to adopt as their mission, bringing identity to people and then using those systems to ensure better access to benefits and services, we can make an even bigger difference in achieving our goals.
That's great. I'm going to ask this gentleman up front, and then I have an interesting question from online.
Thank you. My name is Hallelujah. I'm from Ethiopia, but I study at LSE.
Oh, great.
Thanks. My question is, I know it's a classic challenge, but recently the Rex Tillerson, he said, if I get it right, I think democracy and human rights won't be on the top of the agenda of US's foreign relations. And the message that has been coming out of the White House hasn't been any different as well. And it has been it's always a delicate balance, and it's a very controversial issue. But from the perspective of development, humanitarian interventions and philanthropy, as former head of the USAID and now as head of the Rockefeller Foundation, how do organizations like the USAID or the Rockefeller Foundation combine their development work with issues of human rights and democracy? Because I felt like it's one piece that was missing from this presentation, in this conversation. Because the last point that I'm trying to make is, of course, you know Ethiopia very well, and you've known Meles well, I think, as well. There were some impressive developments and progress in Ethiopia, for example, in education, health, infrastructure. But because of that gap, we've had a lot of political instability, and people have been destroying these very institutions that are delivering these services. So how do philanthropists, international organizations trying to address this classical challenge?
Thanks for that question. And let me ask one other easy one while you're at it. This comes in part from Belinda Dotson from Western University in Canada. Wants to hear your thoughts on gender equality and migration. And let me just expand it a little bit. Obviously, a lot of the things that we've been talking about will depend on gender equality if they're ever going to come to fruition. The end of extreme poverty, questions about work and fair work, all of these issues. And we're still a long ways away. So I'm kind of curious to hear some of your thoughts on where you see the potential for progress, and is that something that Rockefeller focuses on? So two easy questions.
Well, thank you. To the first question on human rights and democracy, and I think you quoted Secretary of State Rex Tillerson. To me, the things he said are, if they're true, they're disastrous. And even worse than his words are the example that our own president is setting, right? Like I've sat in the room with more than one leader on more than one continent and made the point that, your daughter or your son-in-law shouldn't have undue access to your public government systems because that's not considered appropriate governance in this day and age. So, look, and I don't mean that in a personal way against anyone in the U.S. government. I just mean the example we set and the power of that example is hugely important. And when President Obama would travel and meet with leaders, the power of his example allowed all these civil society groups in Ethiopia and Senegal and Kenya and Afghanistan and Honduras to stand together and say, there's a North Star here, and we're not going to get there right away, but we're going to wake up every day and fight for what is right when it comes to democracy, democratic governance, and transparency in government. And I think it's harder to do if America fails to live up to that, its role as the world's example of striving to improve our democratic processes and standing for democracy and human rights in our foreign policy. We haven't always gotten it right, as you know, and in many settings it's harder to, you advocate for things, but you also have to do, you have to have a multifaceted approach to your diplomacy so that you're engaging on things even as you're advocating for other things and not making as much progress. But the idea that we're just going to stop advocating for human rights, for democracy, for gender equality, for domestic resource mobilization and taxation, for anti-corruption, for anti-nepotism, all these things that are the bedrock of values that animate American foreign policy, I think is a disaster and is going to take us all backwards, and it's why so many people are leaving the Foreign Service in the United States right now. That said, your question was really about the Rockefeller Foundation and what might we do. And I think we're looking at some things that we can do, and we see lots of opportunities for philanthropic partners to come together and help bring transparency and visibility in particular to certain types of behaviors we're seeing in country after country, and have had a history of doing that type of work as well. On gender, the things that the Rockefeller Foundation has focused on for a very long time, food security, global health outcomes, under 5 child survival, fair and equitable or reasonable work and access to jobs in certain and livelihoods and settings, have all disproportionately been about, are you helping women be better and more effective in carrying out those roles, right? A woman getting $1 of income is much more likely to transmit that dollar into welfare improvements for her family, into kids going to school, into communities rising out of poverty, than that same $1 of income going to men. So we will continue in all those areas of work to stay super focused on ensuring that the benefits of our work accrue to women. One project is an example of that. It's called the Alliance for a Green Revolution for Africa. It's an African-led institution that Rockefeller and Gates started in 2006, but now is a large-scale public partnership. And they work with women scientists, women farmers, and have an understanding that 70+% of farm labor is actually done by women. And so up and down the leadership change, they have women in those roles, and the investment focus is very much on women farmers. That, I think, is an example of getting it right. There are unfortunately lots of examples of not getting it right. And one tragic one that I'm still haunted by is in our humanitarian responses. I still think we undervalue how important protection of women is, and I don't understand how so many years after this has been so visible, we don't have the ability to put basic lighting and safety systems in refugee and migratory camps that are serving populations that are displaced, because that's where violence against women is extraordinarily high. But that's one example of things we need to do better in order to really live up to the rhetoric around women and girls in this work. And let's be clear, that the current federal policy in the United States is going to move a lot of money away from groups that care a lot about gender outcomes in the context of the fight on poverty.
So, right here, and then gentlemen across the aisle as we creep across. Yeah, we've.
Hi, that's working. My name is Erica. I'm also an LSE master's student. And my question relates to the Ebola response, and you had referenced that healthcare in those countries was lacking before Ebola happened. And I think that a big criticism of the response has been that after it ended, those healthcare facilities that had come just for the response had then dissipated. And I think that part of that is kind of a result of this results-based philanthropy, because it disincentivizes more of the long-term goals in favor of short-term response that we can measure results and we can have a real impact for. So now, as a philanthropist, how do you think we overcome that kind of short-term vision of needing to get immediate responses and not looking towards prevention that may not have a measurable response at all?
They're doing a good job of picking students at LSE, apparently. And this gentleman right here, Mike, that's okay. That one's not working, sorry.
Yeah, my name is Murtaza Okera. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for coming and thank you for organizing as well. Yes, I'm a student at King's College London, doing a Master's in Disasters Adaptation and Development. Now, my question is more towards looking at the world problem that really preoccupies human thought, and that is of the social system. And when it comes to understanding which social system is good for us human beings in the sense of it being a happy social system, and if we go towards, say, understanding, say, yes, this capitalistic democratic system is fantastic, then what is Rockefeller doing in bringing about individual rights and social rights, in bringing this balance where we see current, large, private, or even individual actors that may be a source for exploitation of social rights, and therefore reform initiatives in its core or in its essence are or may not truly save lives and not tackle the root causes of climate and poverty issues. And I don't.
That's an excellent question. I'll let me do the Ebola one first, and then I'll try to close on that.
Thank you.
On Ebola, you know, I'm not sure I fully agree that being results-oriented means you have to be short-term in focus. We were running the response in Liberia, for example, and one of the things we found was a group called Global Communities that had built a lot of long-term presence and connectivity in rural communities by asking questions, speaking to people living in the villages that were affected, had started to understand that it was really even more than person-to-person contact with a live patient. It was the burial practices and the cultural practices around washing and treating and honoring the bodies of the deceased that were accounting for almost 70% of transmission. And because they had that results-oriented mindset, said we want to find what is the largest source of transmission and tackle that. And then they came up together with the WHO and others with kind of innovative ways to put a burial team together. And you might have seen photos of their fully masked teams that would go into communities and in an honorable way work with community leaders to get access to the bodies and remove them in a dignified way so that they were not sources of further transmission. And the same effort was then sort of in Sierra Leone, DFID tried to do the same thing because it was working and sent a team, I think, from the UK. But because they didn't have the long history of working in those communities, they were seen as just people wearing masks, right? And people said, no, I don't want to give my father or my mother or my brother or my sister to you after they're deceased because we don't trust you. And that kind of local community trust, whether it's through community health workers that have a track record of working in a community, or in this case, this social development group called Global Communities that had a long track record of delivering results for families in those villages, that contributes to being much more efficient in then achieving the outcome you're seeking, whether it's a community health outcome or a pandemic prevention outcome or anything else. So look, sometimes people are too focused on the short term, and the processes of forcing groups to get data back to funding institutions like Rockefeller or USAID don't help with that. But we need to find a way to be results-oriented and understand that building long-term community trust and community contacts is a part of getting the result efficiently and not the problem. On the other question, that's a big question about the future of capitalism and about how we think about understanding the distribution of wealth and power in our societies. I spent a lot of time thinking that challenge was maybe outside of the scope of what we could achieve with results-oriented development programs at places like USAID. But I'll tell you, after this last election and looking at the data, you're onto something. And the reality is, in the United States, it's white men of a certain age group that have had the largest and only actual increase in mortality rates and decrease in longevity in the post-World War II era because of the opioid crisis and other challenges they experience that are fundamentally tied to a sense of communities fraying and people being left behind. There's an economist out of Stanford named Raj Shetty that has done incredible work. And if you look at the work, it says if you were born in the United States, if you were born in 1940 or 1950 or 1960, ironically, unless your last name was Rockefeller, you were more than likely to do better economically than your parents. And that reality animated a lot of the optimism that allowed America to be a great country abroad, that allowed us to be the world's humanitarian leader, allowed us to be proud as an example. It was the reason so many immigrants came to the US to chase that American dream. If you're born in 1980, it's the first post-World War II cohort in the United States population where you are statistically more likely to do worse than your parents. And it's not just if your parents are Rockefellers, now it's if your parents are all the way down the economic spectrum. And I think unless we understand in our country that the needs of, that we need to build an economy that's really inclusive of everyone. I met a girl in New Orleans during my visit in our 100 RC program, and Mayor Mitch Landrieu asked her, said, well, tell Raj, tell him about the violence in the community you grew up in. How many of your friends had been shot or killed during your childhood? She was 21, and she said more than 2 dozen, more than 20, more than 2 dozen. And then we were in, we see in our work in more rural communities, people feeling left out and left behind, and these huge upticks in drug use and drug addiction in the United States that's clearly related to economies and communities falling apart because of a lack of identity and other economic challenges. These issues matter. And so I don't know the answer, but certainly it's part of our mission at the Rockefeller Foundation to work on inclusive growth. On a global basis, we think that's a lot about energy poverty. Domestically, we're looking at what can we do to contribute to building an economy that's fairer and has more access and can genuinely rebuild an American dream and a pathway to an American dream for a greater proportion of our people. And I think it's important if you're working on development and if you're going to tackle all the things Alex mentioned as the political challenges we face today, to realize we got to bring everyone along, and that starts with making everyone feel confident about their future. Too many Americans don't feel that way today, and I think that's part of why we have the situation we have.
So, Raj, you've been incredibly generous with your time, and I want all of these good people to walk out here a little bit happier than they are right now. And we're going to fix some of that with wine and food outside. But let me just ask you one last question. You have been doing this work every hour of your waking life, at least as far as I see. But you wake up every morning inspired to keep doing it. What is it that inspires you every day?
Well, the biggest thing that inspires me every day is, despite all the noise and all the negativity, we've talked a lot about the politics today, we're actually winning the big fight. And if we do the right things and we invest in the right innovation and we pick the right partners and we build the right partnerships and collaborations, we can actually end child death as we know it around the world. We can bring in and usher in a new way of producing protein and micronutrients and getting it to kids so that the huge rates of stunting and malnutrition that hold people back go way, way down. Our capacity, you asked the question about data, but our capacity to kind of pinpoint and target and understand which households are most requiring of support, coupled with technology that does give everybody a biometric identity, that allows every citizen to be heard, that gives the right kind of leaders the capacity to remove hundreds of thousands of ghost workers off the books in certain countries. All of those tools and all of that capability will help us succeed at ending extreme poverty, and will help us succeed at building a world where kids don't die of simple diseases. And ultimately will help us do that despite the challenges of climate and despite part of the challenges of politics. And frankly, I think just as we've seen this current politics be a reaction to the last era, I think there's going to be a reaction to this one. Because certainly in our country, in the US, when people see what's going on, they might be angry, they may feel left out, they may feel like they haven't been listened to, but they have values, and they care about others. And I think it's just a matter of time before we're kind of back to our more traditional role of being a nation and a foreign policy that at least tries to embed values of human rights and decency and development in everything we do.
Well, as my grandmother used to say, from your mouth to God's ears. It has been a great pleasure and honor having you here. I really thank all of you for coming out tonight on an August night to listen to Raj. It's been a real pleasure for me as well. We have had a long-standing partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation on a variety of the issues that Raj has talked about, and a lot of great work that I encourage you to go look up online that speaks in depth to some of the challenges that Raj has outlined. So thanks again for being here.